Let me say welcome. I'm glad to see so many of you here today. You're in for a real treat tonight. I'm Jim Woodrick, and I'll be the moderator for our panel discussion. And I want to begin by thanking John McGee for the idea for this program, and to Ken Ashworth for helping design it. And also to Ruth Sunil for making available the Oppenheimer movie last night. And so let me ask you, how many of you have seen the movie now? I bet there's a big show. That's wonderful. That's really good. And even if you didn't know about it, you know about the story of the making of the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project, a really critical piece of American history, and we're going to talk about some of that tonight. The movie does a good job of introducing you to Oppenheimer and to a dozen or more of the individuals who played a key role in that Manhattan Project and its aftermath. The work that they pioneered continues today. And our panelists here today spent most of their work careers working in some fashion relative to what came from the Oppenheimer movie. And you're going to hear about that tonight. You're going to hear about their experiences that they've had, their work history and their experiences. And you can see their career summaries on this slide. They all have advanced degrees in nuclear physics or something close to that from the two most prominent universities in that field, and that's Princeton and Cal Berkeley. Tonight's program is in three parts. The first part, we're going to ask each of the panelists to give you a description of their work history. I think you'll find that fascinating. And then we're going to ask each of them some what I call anecdotes, some examples of some things that happened in their work career that relate to this that I think you'll find absolutely fascinating. And finally, we're going to leave plenty of time for you to ask questions. These are the facilities that participated in the Manhattan Project, or at least the major ones. It began with the demonstration of nuclear fission in that football field house in Chicago. Uranium for the bombs was made in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And down in the lower right there, you can see some women who are called the Kellytron girls. They were the Rosie the Riveters of this particular thing. They were hired to run the control rooms for the mass spectrometers that were located outside that separated the U-235 isotope that we needed for one of the bombs. Plutonium was made in several nuclear reactors in Hanford, Washington, and Sandia Lab in Albuquerque was established during this project as our major weapons development center, and it still operates today. And of course, there's Los Alamos. That's the scientific nerve center of the project, and still a huge research facility today. Many women also work, by the way, doing math computations for the scientists at Los Alamos. So I want to start by having us watch a brief trailer from the movie. And I want to remind you, you've probably seen it in the news, but they just came out with the nominations for Oscars for this year. Oppenheimer got 11. More than twice Barbie, and I don't know who was second. Anyway, you weren't the only ones who really enjoyed that movie. So let's watch a trailer.
National emergency.
Didn't need a charge.
We're in a race against the Nazis. And I know what it means if the Nazis have a bomb.
We have a 12-month head start.
18. How could you possibly know that?
We've got one hope.
All America's industrial might and scientific innovation connected here. A secret laboratory. Keep everyone there until it's done.
Let's go recruit some scientists.
Build a town, build it fast. We don't let scientists bring their families, we'll never get the best.
Why would we go to the middle of nowhere for who knows how long?
Why? Why? How about because this is the most important thing that ever happened in the history of the world?
You're the great improviser, but this you can't do in your head.
Are we saying there's a chance that when we push that button, we destroy the world?
Chances are near zero.
Near zero.
What do you want for the theory alone?
Zero.
I can perform this miracle.
World War II would be over.
Our boys would come home.
That's happening, isn't it?
World will remember this day.
Okay, now let's hear from each of our three panelists and let them tell you about their work careers. I want to start with Dave Benson. Has a PhD from Princeton, and he worked some at Los Alamos and spent most of his time at Sandia Lab. Dave, tell us about your career.
Thanks, Jim. First, I'd like to thank you for the great job that you've done organizing this program this evening. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dave Benson. First, a bit about my background. I was a New Mexico resident for more than 55 years before moving with my wife Nancy to Westminster. We've been here for about a year and a half now. I worked my entire career as a physicist in 3 research labs in New Mexico: Los Alamos National Lab, Sandia National Lab, and the U.S. Air Force Weapons Lab. After earning my doctorate in physics at Princeton University, I reported for duty to the Air Force Weapons Lab in Albuquerque. My military service was on the Weapons Lab research staff. Then I was hired by Sandia Labs, where I worked as a senior researcher until my retirement in 1999. I've been to all of the places portrayed in the Oppenheimer film and crossed paths with several of the principal scientists, including Oppenheimer himself. In the summers of 1964 and 65, I was employed as a physics intern at Los Alamos, where I designed hardware for nuclear tests to measure neutron scattering cross-sections and assisted in the studying of magnetic properties of nuclear materials. After completing my doctorate in 1968, I served the Air Force Weapons Lab until 1972. I left the Air Force with the rank of captain. At the Weapons Lab, I measured mechanical properties of ballistic missile materials and developed high-power laser system diagnostics. The balance of my career was spent at Sandia. I was awarded 3 U.S. patents. My research involved using pulsed electron beams and pulsed reactors to determine the properties of materials at extreme temperatures. I received recognition for determining the boiling point of uranium oxide and for developing a novel method for cooling microelectronics. Okay, your turn, Tom.
Okay. Well, I worked in Los Alamos from 1976 to 2003.
Tom, you have to get close to the mic. You go a little closer.
How's that?
Better.
Okay. I worked in Los Alamos from 1976 to 2003. And basically 4 areas: advanced fuels for liquid metal fast beta reactors, light reactor safety, nuclear criticality safety, and radiation safety. I spent my last 23 years at Los Alamos working in the last 2 areas. That's the only one I'm going to discuss, only 2 areas I'm going to discuss today. I worked in nuclear criticality safety, and I'm going to give a little background on accounting for the presence of water is a fundamental tenet of criticality safety. Important because fissile configurations may have or accidentally have water, and two hydrogen nuclei in water rapidly slow down neutrons, making them much more likely to cause fission when they enter uranium or plutonium. Consequently, the critical masses for configurations of water may be much lower than those from bare spheres of plutonium or uranium. In fact, I remember right, the minimum critical mass in homogeneous mixtures of water and uranium can be in plutonium is 450 grams, and for uranium is 800 grams. So that's much less than the very critical masses that were associated with the atomic bomb. Now, most criticality accidents, and there's been like 50 or 60 of them throughout the world, have occurred during chemical water processing of plutonium and uranium in large containers. Now, recently there's been a lot of mitigation to reduce the possibility of criticality accidents. An example of a criticality project I worked on was the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident. I performed some kind of scoping criticality calculation to evaluate criticality potential when removing collapsed fuel from the bottom of the reactor vessel at 3 Mile Island. In radiation safety, there were two interesting projects I worked on. One was the calculation of doses from that Neptunium-237 sphere during fabrication, which was built to experimentally determine the critical mass at the critical experiments facility. And the last one, I think one of the more interesting, was the calculation of radiation doses and the design of the dual axis radiographic hydrodynamic test facility, commonly referred to as DART. That's DART with an H, D-A-R-H-T. And DART generates high energy electron pulses that in turn produce photon pulses to image implosions of mock-up weapons, nuclear weapons pits. Physics was very interesting. We had a good design team. And if you search for D-A-R-H-T on the web, you'll be overloaded with descriptions of DART with an H.
And I forgot to tell you up front, but I'll pass out the quiz before we leave. We're going to be tested on what you just heard. Ray Arbach.
Well, in 1956, Eva and I moved to Berkeley, where Eva received her bachelor's degree and I got my doctorate. And then on October 4th, 1957, the Russians sent Sputnik up into space. Some of you may remember how the United States reacted. We were behind. At that point in time, I realized that a physicist might actually be able to earn a living. The government invested heavily, and we went, after my doctorate, with one child in tow, to Oxford University on an NSF fellowship, and then from there to Harvard for a couple of years, and then to UCLA for 30 years, where I was in the physics department, and the last 10 years I was provost of the College of Letters and Science, the largest academic unit in the entire University of California. After that period, I was asked and accepted the position of chancellor at the University of California, Riverside, at that time a small campus, and Eva and I moved out, took our home right on the campus, and set to enhance the neighborhood and the environment around that campus, and to encourage students of color and of broad backgrounds in our area. Riverside is part of the so-called Inland Empire, to come and get a college education. After 10 years of working together, the two of us moved east. The President of the United States, Bush 43, W.H. Bush, nominated me for the directorship of the Office of Science. Some of you may not know the Office of Science. You may be aware of the National Science Foundation. But the Office of Science in the Department of Energy supports 90% of the physical science research, basic research, in the United States. The Office of Science run those big iron facilities that you read about, namely the accelerators at Berkeley and at Chicago and at Brookhaven and at Oak Ridge. I was responsible for 10 of the Department of Energy's laboratories. And these were the laboratories that did basic science, but fed the weapons laboratories that you've heard about, namely at Livermore, at Los Alamos, and at Sandia. In my 7 years working in the Bush administration, I learned a great deal about physicists and working with Congress and what Washington was like. Contrary to many of you, or shall I say to the conventional wisdom, it's a very exciting and rewarding place to be. We were able to start with a budget of around $3 billion, and when I left, it was up to $5 billion. Right now, the budget of the Office of Science and the National Science Foundation, these are the agencies that support basic research, are in the order of $8 billion each. And it's a testimony to the commitment of our country to support basic science across the board in the United States. I was then nominated for the position of Undersecretary for Science in the Department of Energy, the very first one, actually, to hold that position. So I had the great honor of being confirmed by Congress twice, something that is quite an experience, actually. In that role, I was responsible for all of the basic science at the Department of Energy. And it is an extraordinary field encompassing both the weapons laboratories and those of the Office of Science, who work very closely together, nurturing the scientific atmosphere in which our protection through nuclear weapons can be assured. After 7 years in Washington, Eva and I moved here. If you weren't born in Texas, well, we came as soon as we could. And we have enjoyed being here. I'm at the University of Texas in Austin. I still continue my research, and it's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you.
So let's hold the questions, please.
No, I'm not. It's a question. I'm giving you an answer. I was in Nagasaki exactly 1 week after the bomb was dropped.
Bernie said that he was at Nagasaki 1 week after the bomb was dropped. So he's got a little first-hand experience from a different end of it. All right, we heard some really impressive work histories. That's good dinner conversation next time we visit with each other. Now, what I want to do is to ask our panelists to tell us some anecdotes about some things about their work experience and some interactions with some of the people from the Manhattan Project that you saw in the movie. The people that you're going to hear about today were really the giants of physics at that time. They were the top scientists in the world at that point in time. And actually, we have Hitler to thank for them being here. That's true. Most of them were forced to flee Europe and all of the horrors that were going on in the 1930s leading up to the war. And so they came here, and these men absolutely hated Hitler, and they knew that the Nazis were going to build a bomb, and they were dedicated that we would get there first. And so they're really an absolutely remarkable group of people that you've seen in this movie and that these gentlemen have actually known. Let's see, should have those up. All right, I want to start with Oppenheimer. You can see his background up here today. And I want to start by asking Ray as an undergraduate student, you attended a physics lecture by Oppenheimer. Would you tell us about that lecture and your interaction with that man?
Well, there were a group of us, we were all sophomores at Caltech, and Oppenheimer was remarkable. He had come, obviously, to talk about physics, but he enjoyed teaching. Even though at Princeton, he didn't do any teaching. So we had a special group of all of the sophomores, and Oppenheimer talked about what he loved, namely particle physics and all of the new discoveries that were being made. This was in 1954. And he talked about one particle, the W particle, and the Z particle, and the lambda particle. Most of us who were sophomores had no idea what he was talking about. But he took us through what we were exposed to. Remember that we were sophomores, and so physics was always a regular subject. It was taught in the textbooks. Everything was laid out for you. And here was a complete mystery. All of these particles had no relationship to one another. 2 years later, he created the phrase, the nuclear zoo. And I remember as a sophomore listening to him talking, and like a sophomore, I waited till he finished, and then I raised my hand and said, Dr. Oppenheimer, does this make any sense? And of course, that was the whole point of his talk. It didn't make any sense. And he sort of smiled and said, well, you know, through his smile, I think he got it.
Dave, you also heard Oppenheimer speak at a lecture as a grad student at Princeton. So what was your impression of the man?
I had the good fortune to attend a seminar that Oppenheimer presented in 1965 on quantum physics. I was a second-year graduate student at Princeton. He spoke at the prestigious Institute for Advanced Study. He had been hired as the director of this private think tank after his government security clearance was revoked in 1954. This dramatic hearing at the Atomic Energy Commission when his security clearance was revoked was one of the pivotal scenes in the Oppenheimer movie.
Thank you. Now I want to move to Los Alamos. And I'd like to ask Tom, you all lived in Los Alamos for 27 years. It's a small town. You can see the population is like 13,000. But it's got a great science heartbeat. And so tell us what it was living in such a remote place with a single focus economy surrounded by bundles of really smart people.
I want to proceed with my experience in so-called Manhattan Project pioneers. Okay? How's that? I never saw Oppenheimer. He was long dead before I came to Los Alamos. I saw Niels Bohr, Hans Beatty walking around the laboratory. I saw Morris Bad very often, but I never had any interaction with him. But I was searching online, and I remember I had to really scratch my memory. There are three pioneers, and they're not in the movie. They were Richard Baker, J. Mark Carlson, and Hugh Paxton. Now, Hugh Paxton was the guy Richard Baker was the guy that probably hired me. He was considered to be the father of plutonium chemistry. He was recruited by Oppenheimer. So you had to have more than just pure physicists, okay? And Mark Carson was a Canadian that came over with the British mission in May of 1945. And he was leader of the theoretical division for 27 years. And he managed to get Stan Ulam and Edward Teller, who didn't like each other, to work together. And Hugh Paxton was considered the father of criticality safety, and he was involved in the area at least through the late 90s. Los Alamos was mostly egalitarian. At the lab, everyone was on a first-name basis from the laboratory director to the janitor. This generally carried over into the community, although there was plenty of eccentricity among scientists and engineers. Los Alamos County has two sections. The original town's at the hill, which is a population of 13,000, elevation about 7,300 feet. And the White Rock section, which has been 10 miles southeast, and probably about 900 feet lower, a population of about 6,000. When we arrived in Los Alamos in 1976, there was no furniture store, mortuary, car dealership, and most importantly, no McDonald's. Residents bought and sold cars in a public parking lot called the Lemon Lot. Now, this is something, am I right? This is my wife's word. She told me not to say it, but she wrote them out, and I think they're pretty good. They're more poetic than what I would write. When we moved to Los Alamos, we soon learned everyone came from all parts of the globe. We were strangers in a strange land. We made lifelong friendships that we treasure to this day.
Fascinating. Okay, let's switch to another one of these guys, actually two of them. Eugene Wigner was instrumental, along with this Leo Szilard, in creating the letter that was sent to President Roosevelt, signed by Albert Einstein, warning him that the Nazis were going to build a bomb and encouraging him to do something about it. And Dave, you sat around a table with Wigner and some other students discussing solid state physics at a colloquium he presented. So tell us about Eugene Wigner.
Well, Eugene Wigner was born in Hungary at a time when Budapest was a center for the study of advanced mathematics. As Hitler rose to power, Wigner and a number of his talented Hungarian mathematicians, men like Edward Teller, John von Neumann, Leo Szilard, they expatriated to the United States, where they played an important role in the Manhattan Project. Wigner became a U.S. citizen in 1937. He went on to win the Nobel Prize for his work on elementary particles. I was sitting at a small table in the mid-60s discussing solid-state physics at a periodic colloquia with Professor Wigner and a few other graduate students. I didn't realize at the time what an important role this balding gentleman with a heavy, hard-to-understand accent had played in the Manhattan Project. His meeting with Einstein and Szilard resulted in the famous letter to President Roosevelt, urging the U.S. to build an atomic bomb before Germany made such a weapon. Wigner's group at Los Alamos designed the production nuclear reactors to convert uranium to weapons-grade plutonium used in the bomb tested at Trinity Site, that dramatic opening scene in the Oppenheimer film.
Okay, this next guy I know you're going to recognize something from the movie. His name is Richard Feynman. And he was one of the first scientists who joined Oppenheimer at Los Alamos. He was a pioneer in particle physics, and he's probably best remembered for this simple diagram that he put together that describes what happens when the electron and a positron collide. Ray, you knew Richard Feynman when he was on the faculty at Caltech, and I believe that he was the guy who played the bongo drums in the movie that you saw. And so tell us about Feynman and tell us why that diagram was so important.
Well, you're quite correct. Feynman was a star at Caltech, and we undergraduates would go to every lecture he gave. We would sit at the back of the room and he would talk, and everyone would be locked in attendance. And for us, it was just obvious that he was telling us something we really should know. And then as we left the room, we realized we hadn't understood a word of it. But he was so entertaining and so committed to undergraduates that we all really fell in love with him. He, of course, as a graduate student, invented this picture. It's not quite so simple as the picture shows. At that point in time, quantum electrodynamics was a new field, and the great stars in that area, Schwinger and Dirac and others, had worked out the mathematics. The mathematics were so complex that for almost anyone it was almost impossible. They were impenetrable. And what Feynman did was to figure out how to actually take that mathematics and develop it into a picture. Now, that actually is an integral, and carrying out the integral is hard. But what it did was it gave an organization to these mathematical equations that you couldn't really follow. And so today, no matter if it's high energy physics or condensed matter physics or whatever, we start with pictures just like that in order to give a physical picture to the structure and process of an event that we're trying to calculate and make quantitative. This was done as a graduate student at Cornell.
That'll be on the test also, by the way. All right, here's another really interesting individual. Dorothy McKibben was known as the gatekeeper of Los Alamos. She was Oppenheimer's human resources director. Everyone who hired on there had to go through her for security clearance. And if you have read that book, 109 East Palace Avenue, that's the address of where her office was. And it's, most of you have been to Santa Fe, and if you've eaten in the Shed restaurant, it's just kind of right around the corner from the Shed. And Dorothy was around for a while, and Dave had an interaction with her in the 1970s at a reunion of the scientists who gathered together, and you were there, so tell us about Dorothy at that reunion.
I will do that. It's a famous picture, of course, of Dorothy McKibben with Oppenheimer, and talk a little bit about her. Although she wasn't portrayed in the movie, Dorothy McKibben was arguably one of the most important players in the Manhattan Project. In the small office in Santa Fe at 109 East Palace Avenue, this energetic and efficient young widow was Oppenheimer's right-hand man. She solved all the non-technical problems for folks on the Hill. This is a secret project that Los Alamos came to be called. Scientists and their families reported for work to Dorothy's office in Santa Fe, and therefore thereafter they simply disappeared. As gatekeeper to Los Alamos, she made the arrangements to solve problems in total secrecy. For example, if a staff member developed a bad toothache, Dorothy made a dental appointment for him under a fictitious name, and then arranged transportation to and from the Hill for the scientist. Hoping to catch sight of legendary scientists, Nancy and I attended a late 70s reunion on the Hill of people who had worked on the bomb. The festivities were held outdoors at Ashley Pond in a big field behind Fuller Lodge. MC for the reunion was Norris Bradbury, the longtime lab director who succeeded Oppenheimer. At its conclusion, Bradbury announced he had a surprise for everyone. An elderly woman with a cane rose with some difficulty from her chair, waved to the crowd. Suddenly, it felt like we were at a rock concert. The crowd exploded with a roar of cheers and nonstop applause for the beloved Dorothy McKibben.
So here's Edward Teller. He was the man that was most instrumental in developing the hydrogen bomb. That's kind of the second one that came along. He's also the person in the movie who testified against Oppenheimer in the Atomic Energy Commission's hearing that led to the removal of Oppenheimer's security clearance. And in that role, he was pretty much ostracized by most of the other scientists who were totally supporting Oppenheimer and didn't really appreciate what he'd done. So Tom, you attended some colloquiums by Teller and saw him with his famous walking stick. There's a picture of him in later in life with his walking stick. So tell us about Teller and the walking stick.
Well, the walking stick there is a later version. It's a fancy one. What he had at the time was a roughly hewn one and had a strap on the end of it. And anytime he came to the laboratory, you could hear him because he'd stomp and stomp. Anyway, we'd give a colloquium. He'd march through the aisle up to the stage, still clop, 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 climb the stairs to the stage, clop, 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 sit down in a chair. And if I recall right, he held his stick all the time he was talking. Of course, he never spoke from notes, okay? And so he could talk on forever. Now, my wife remembers some things about him because of nursing interaction with him, but she claims that he wore cowboy boots made with alligator skin, green color. Is that right? Anyway,
And Ray, Teller was involved in a really famous debate with Linus Pauling. And I'd like for you to tell us about that debate and also tell us about how Teller helped you as a grad student get access to some computers.
Well, the debate was held on February 10th in 1958. So this was pretty early on. And it was a debate between Linus Pauling and Teller. Now, you heard about the fact that Teller was not welcomed by the rest of the scientific community. That was also true of students, especially graduate students at the time. We all worshiped Linus Pauling. He taught my freshman chemistry course at Caltech, and we all adopted his accent. We became Pauling students. So here the two of them were. And Pauling was talking, the title of the debate was Fallout and Disarmament. And Pauling was suggesting that we stop nuclear testing, that the fallout had caused innumerable examples of genetic damage across the world, but especially in the United States. And Teller was coming from the perspective of the German treatment of Europe and Jews in particular, and had a very different perspective. For him, remember this is 58, the Soviet Union was just as dangerous as Hitler was in Germany. And by that time, the Soviets had already developed their own hydrogen weapon. And so you were in the middle of the beginning of the Cold War. And it was a furious debate where Pauling talked about 9,000 scientists who all said we should stop testing. And Teller said we have to continue testing if we're to keep up with the Russians. I would like to say that Pauling won the debate. I was certainly on that side. But afterwards, I had to admit, Teller made some very important points. One of his statements was, peace cannot be obtained by wishing for it. And he pointed out that if we stopped testing, there was no way that we could be sure that the Russians would stop testing. And indeed, the Latter brothers showed almost immediately afterwards how you could disguise a nuclear test. Does that remind you of Reagan? Trust, but verify. This was in 1958, and that was the essence of the debate.
There's a very famous scene in this movie, and the scientists weren't 100% sure that when they set that Trinity bomb off, it might not ignite the air and destroy the world. And so Oppenheimer and Leslie Groves are talking, and you can see Leslie asking what's the probability. Oppenheimer says it's near zero, and Leslie Groves says, I want zero. And so Ray, tell us what that meant about that question and answer.
One of the things about Oppenheimer was that he was a scientist, and Groves wanted zero. But for a scientist, that isn't the way the world works. If you remember your calculus, it's the area under a curve, and what you start with is a series of rectangles that try to imitate the area under the curve, but there's always an error because the corner of the triangle, of the rectangle, sticks above the curve. And so in calculus, what you say is that you give me a delta, whatever the number is, and I'll make those rectangles so small that my error epsilon is less than your delta. This is called a limit approach. And that was the mathematics that Oppenheimer believed in and followed and understood. And so when he said it was very small, what he was doing was he was saying, it's approaching zero. You give me an error and I'll make it smaller, but that isn't zero. And that was the reason why the two of them disagreed.
There's a story, I don't think this was in a movie, but it's kind of an interesting story. There was a little bitty house called the Ottowi Bridge House that was on that road to Los Alamos, and it was really famous because the woman that ran it was approached by Oppenheimer to see if she wouldn't just feed every week some of his scientists, and it had a really neat story about that. So Tom, can you tell us about Ottowi Bridge House?
It's on. Can you hear me? Well, I'm going to try to shorten this. I don't recall hearing about Edith Warner during my time at Los Alamos. Doesn't mean I didn't hear it, but I don't remember. This is from 76 to 2004 when we left Los Alamos. I do recall seeing the bridge in Ottawa on the right-hand side when we go to Santa Fe. Okay, I'm not used to doing this. Okay, thanks, Dave. But if you want more information, a good place to start is on YouTube or search, look at some of the Los Alamos Historical Society. There's a lot of positive information on her. The bridge in Ottawa was built in 1924 to attract visitors to Bandit International Monument. Edith Warner came to New Mexico in 1922 for her mental health, I think, mostly. And in 1928, she was hired to be a station manager at Ottawa for the Los Alamos Ranch School. And she watched over the freight shipments when they came to the depot there. And she occupied the station manager's house a short distance away. She expanded her tea house there, eventually to include even a guest house. Anyway, and one of the residents who helped her was named Tolano. And he has an interesting background I won't go into. He came so often to help her that she asked him to stay. And he was 23 years older than her. And the best evidence indicates that the relationship was platonic. Oppenheimer first met Edith in 1937 during one of his pack trips in the area. And they shared a common love for New Mexico. Edith's income disappeared when the Manhattan Project took over the Pajarito Plateau, and resulting in the closing of Los Alamos Ranch School and Bandelier National Monument. Oppenheimer come to her rescue in the spring of '43. He made an informal deal with her to host dinners many times a week, exclusively for Los Alamos scientists and their wives, to unwind from the work intensity on the hill, supposedly. The restaurant had no running water, no electricity or telephone, only wood for cooking and heating. No alcohol was served. The reservations had to be booked in person, and the restaurant was booked once in advance. Oppenheimer had a standing weekly invitation, and Niels Bohr came when he was in town. Tolano and Edith raised their own vegetables. He was famous for her chocolates. Okay, we're probably in time here. Anyway, I suspect some of the other supplies came from Los Alamos, either from people personal or from resources. Anyway, the bridge at Ottawa remained open until '47, when a new bridge was opened. She moved. It was too close for her company, so she moved across the river to a new house. Then I just mention one thing that's kind of interesting. Is the San Alfonso Indians did not need to have they automatically got security clearances because they couldn't speak English. They only understood Tiwi. And so if they didn't understand English, they couldn't be spies, okay? But Spanish was their second language, and English was their third language.
That's a wonderful human interest story, I thought. Okay, those are the two bombs, and we only had two of them in August of 1943. One of them was based on uranium, and the other one was based on plutonium. And so I'd like to ask Ray, why did we pick the uranium bomb to drop first? And also, why didn't we announce ahead of time and show Japan that we had such a device by sitting it off at a safe location? Tell us about the bombs.
Well, first of all, they were never, the first bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, the so-called little boy, which by the way was not little, was never tested. And so there was no indication that it would really work. There were lots of calculations. There was a huge amount of uranium-235, something like 140 pounds of enriched uranium in Little Boy, where you had a target that had about 55 pounds, and then a projectile that would be forced into it to reach critical mass of 85 pounds of uranium. That's a lot of stuff. And it had never been tested, and the fear was that if we announced to the Japanese that we would do a horrendous test over an atoll somewhere in the Pacific, and it didn't work, the Japanese would just laugh at us, and that would be the end of it. And so, if you think about it, it was a real tour de force that it worked at all. It worked, as we know, in a horrible way for those who were its targets. The next bomb was made out of plutonium, and what you may ask, why plutonium and not more uranium? The plutonium is 10 times more efficient and only takes about 17 pounds. It starts off at a size of a softball, and then by virtue of the explosives around it, it's compressed to the size of a tennis ball. And that compression then gives you the critical mass. But every time they tried to develop explosives that would do that, initially, it wasn't spherical. The thing would burst off in some other direction. So it took a long time, actually almost a year, before the explosives were designed in such a way. But there was no proof that it would work. And so the Trinity test was a test to see if the Fat Man, this round thing, would actually work, and of course it did. Now the limits were the Bombay. You couldn't just make this thing as big as you liked. It had to fit in an airplane. And so that was the second bomb. The reason there was a second explosion was that the Japanese showed no signs of remorse, no indication that that explosion over Hiroshima was going to change their mind. And so the second one changed their mind. They didn't know that that's all we had. Those were the only two bombs that were there at present. You may know that during the Cold War, there was enough plutonium produced that we could make 3 bombs a day. But this was in 1944, where the supply of plutonium was so limited. In any case, the debate about whether we should have dropped it or not dropped it is something that has been going on ever since the time of the explosions. It's estimated that it saved 1 million American lives. My uncle was on the team that would have invaded Japan, not to mention the number of Japanese who would have been killed. You can argue that that was all right in retrospect, but Truman made that decision. And that decision lives with us for better or for worse, depending on how you want to look at it.
Another interesting scene in the movie, you saw it several times, there were some marbles being put in a bowl. First the bowl was empty and then gradually it filled up. So Tom, what was the significance of those bowls full of marbles?
Well, I'm going to read what so adding marbles to the large, thank you. Adding marbles to the large glass bowl represents accumulation of uranium needed for little boy, and to the small bowl represents accumulation of plutonium needed for fat man. Simple as that, in my view. There is no evidence that this actually ever occurred. And my opinion is the depiction is a bit corny and unnecessary. But that's, when you make a movie, you have a lot of laughter.
You're absolutely right about that. Okay, one of our other famous scientists, this is Hans Bethe. He was the head of theoretical physics division at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project. And Dave, you attended a series of lectures that he gave. So tell us about this giant of science.
Hans Bethe. When I was a summer intern student at Los Alamos in the mid-60s, I attended a colloquium that Bethe presented at the laboratory. This distinguished gentleman with a very receding hairline and glasses was an excellent speaker. Shortly thereafter, in 1967, he won the Nobel Prize for his theory explaining the distribution of masses in the periodic table. Born in Germany, Bethe had fled to the U.S. in 1933 after Hitler came to power. The theoretical physicist had been dismissed from his teaching position at the university because his maternal grandparents were Jews. He became a professor of physics at Cornell University in 1935. In 1943, he went to work at Los Alamos as the head of T Division, where much of the project's theoretical work was done. His analyses were used to estimate the explosive power of the bomb prior to the Trinity test. He resumed his work at Cornell after the war and periodically returned to Los Alamos as a valued consultant.
Thank you. This last slide is more a modern story, and I wanted Ray here to give us some of his experience when he was with the DOE, talking about the aftermath of making this uranium and plutonium at those two sites, Paducah, Kentucky, and Bristol, which is Hanford. And the fact that we spilled some of that stuff back then, and we're still trying to clean it up. Tell us that story, Ray.
It's a sad story, but remember there was a war on. And you can imagine when you see General Grove, what the mobilization of the country had, the pressure that it had put on Hanford and on Oak Ridge to produce fissile material. You had to produce it, and you had to produce it fast. As a consequence, they weren't terribly careful about the side products, which were highly radioactive. To give you some idea, at Hanford, it's 580 square miles of, that's the Hanford site, of which 60 square miles are contaminated. The best estimate of cleanup cost is $528 billion. It's everywhere. It's in the trenches, it's in the ground, and so-called Beto zone. In Paducah, Kentucky, you have a situation for the gaseous diffusion that produced the uranium. That's 750 acres, or almost 5 square miles. The town of Paducah lives off of cleaning up that site. And I can tell you, when I met in the DOE, the senators from Kentucky and the senators from the state of Washington, there was no way that we were not going to continue the support of those two communities in terms of jobs. We might try to influence them, we might try to make things more efficient, but those jobs had to stay. And so they have. And it's going to take probably close to 100 years and for to clean up what happened in 2 years in the Manhattan Project.
Amazing. Okay, I'd like to have you all thank these three gentlemen for the program that they just did. Now, let me open the floor for questions. Let's see, is somebody, I need to get somebody maybe to pass around the microphone. Oswaldo, would you do that? Thank you. Roger's got a question.
David, I think you probably, well, maybe all three of you would know this, but you mentioned radiation studies. And we held a conference in Hiroshima. And one of the girls, we didn't meet her, but she wrote a book. She was in 3rd grade and was on her way to school on a beautiful sunny day. And she looked up and saw the Enola Gay aircraft and thought it was beautiful against the sun. And then they dropped the bomb. She survived and wrote a book about that. And I really recommend it to you. It's a very gripping response. But my question is, at that conference, we had the head of our girls' school in Hiroshima who was there when the bomb was dropped. Now, the Hiroshima Gakuin Girls' School is in the surrounding hills. It looks down on the city of Hiroshima. And so he gathered all of his girls and faculty, and they went up into the mountains for almost a week because they did not know what had happened and what the result would be, and then eventually came back to the school and learned about more of it. Was that a safe thing to do? Would radiation have, they wanted to get up and away from the city center, even further than they were. Would that have provided any protection for those girls? And how long would that radiation lasts for those students?
Quick answer.
The answer is yes. The further away you go, the less the radiation damage. The Department of Energy headquarters are in Washington, D.C., but the action is in Germantown, and that's about 30 miles away. And the reason that it's 30 miles away is because that's the radius of the fallout from a conventional nuclear explosion, not from a hydrogen bomb, but from an atomic bomb. And so the further away you are, the less the radiation. However, the radiation lasts for millions of years. The lifetime, the half-life of many of these isotopes is extraordinarily long. Some of them are short, but others are quite long.
Bernard's got a question.
I need to explain what I was saying. After the second bomb was dropped and the Japanese surrendered, that there was a prisoner of war camp 10 miles from the Nagasaki, Italy. And my ship, which was a team carrier, which is a very small carrier, flew our planes off and took us to become a South hospital ship. So we went in with a cruiser to be sure we could land, and we were able to land to pick up the prisoners. Now, that was exactly 2 weeks after the bomb had been dropped. We had no idea what the radiation meant. So they let us, who wanted to go ashore, to tour around that basin where the bomb had dropped. And it was heavy with, obviously with, what do you call it, napkin. Anyway, but none of us got any, we were on a truck that just drove around, and then we got back on our ship and picked up the prisoners and then left. But it was actually 10 days after the bomb was dropped.
And we're delighted you're still with us tonight. Who's got another question?
Well, thank you, but that is, I just wanted to explain the whole relation.
That's great, thank you. I think I saw Stuart with a hand up over here still.
Of the physicists that you guys experienced, which one really struck you as oh, this guy is really bright?
Did y'all hear his question?
These guys were all really bright. To select one individual, really tried to place weight on some aspect of the technology. The technology in this time period was advancing very quickly, and there were very good people working on the technology. So conventional terms of IQ, whatever, probably meaningless in terms of the accomplishments of these giants of physics.
What I meant is you listened to a seminar and you went, oh my God, that's what I'm getting at in terms of the brilliance of one of these physicists.
Yes.
Okay.
No
Who's got a
preference.
question? I can't see who it is. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for coming. I'm really enjoying this. I thought a 3-hour museum, I was going to have to keep pounding my husband and myself to keep awake. I couldn't fall asleep after it. It was just so amazing. I have 2 questions. The first is, after what happened here with the amount of radiation and everything, it seems like we haven't learned anything about the waste products. I mean, the scientists there were so concerned about, what was going to happen to the people they were dropping from my perspective from the movie, is that, was this all General Groves thing that don't worry about the stuff that's coming and we have to get rid of later, we're just gonna toss it on the side? I mean, I can't understand how they were not thinking about how they were making it and what was left over.
We were at war, and the whole country had mobilized. What was so extraordinary was Los Alamos. If you think about, as we have seen at the beginning, all the different laboratories that were literally square miles that were built in a matter of weeks or months, it was extraordinary because we were at war. And when you're at war, survival is the issue. Afterwards, you saw that with Oppenheimer. People began to get nervous about what had been accomplished. And I think it's fair to say that there are many scientists who have really carried on his tradition of trying to get an understanding. We have been able to avoid a nuclear exchange. Think about it. The Russians, 10,000, 20,000 weapons. You're seeing it today in what's happening with the Russian invasion and the threat of tactical nuclear weapons, but they still haven't been used. And that was one of Beta's arguments, namely that people talk about the delicate balance of terror that nuclear weapons have provided. But in fact, it's pretty remarkable. There has not been the use of nuclear weapons since Nagasaki.
Question over here on this side.
Just one more question was, you all live there. Could you, what the movie didn't explain was, what was the day-to-day life of the wives and the children? I was just wondering if you could speak to that. Like, where did you go shopping?
Okay, I'm gonna learn eventually. No, it was pretty routine. It was different living in Los Alamos, I guess. Any serious shopping had to be done in Santa Fe or Albuquerque. But going to work, we all drove the same road. There was a 10-minute rush hour traffic at the crossing bridge over to the laboratory. I personally bicycle most of the time. I'm not sure I'm answering your question. What was it? All communities have similarities, I guess.
I was just wondering, did the women get together to play bridge? All I saw was them putting up poles, and then the first thing that Kitty says is there's no kitchen. And then it came to mind with like, there's no kitchen, does that mean they eat in the mess?
Well, my time was much later, so there were plenty of kitchen. All the houses were privately owned, including those that the government sold to the renters sometime in the late 50s.
Let's ask Max.
It might be interesting, I already know some about it, but it might be interesting for people to know that there's an organization in Texas called Pantex Ordnance located in the Texas Panhandle. It might be good for people just to know that the tentacles of this story resonate today, and a big employer up in the Texas Panhandle just out of Amarillo. I think you may have had it under your jurisdiction when you were.
No, that was controlled by NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Agency, and they were the ones who controlled the 3 weapons laboratories. We controlled the other 10, but they weren't separate. I mean, I was at Los Alamos often. We supported one another. The basic research at the weapons laboratories is superb, and they need it. in order to make sure that the weapons are reliable and safe. There's no real distinction, except for the purpose of the laboratory, between the weapons labs and the other labs, where the basic science is the same across them. The applications may be different, but the basic science is the same.
Okay, thank you. Let's end the program tonight. One more round of applause. Thank you, John.